50 people sentenced to die for crimes they did not commit. Not because the evidence was perfect, but because the human mind is fragile, biased, and dangerously easy to manipulate. Today, we enter the psychological machinery that turns innocence into a death sentence. This documentary contains descriptions of prison conditions and violence for educational purposes based on verified sources. Viewer discretion is advised. For more deep research of prison documentary like this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Wrongful convictions are not accidents. They are the result of predictable psychological failures. Memory distorted under pressure, investigators convinced they can read guilt, communities demanding closure, and systems rewarding speed over truth. Across the United States, more than 3,400 known exonerations have been documented by the National Registry of Exonerations. At least 195 of those individuals once faced the death penalty, some just hours away from execution. This documentary examines how innocent people end up on death row using verified research from the American Psychological Association, interrogation studies funded by the NIJ, decades of prison psychology analysis from Craig Haney, and real wrongful conviction cases documented by the Innocence Project. Each chapter dives into the psychological traps that pulled these men and women into the system, and how some survived long enough to walk free. The moment innocence collides with authority. Long before an innocent person meets a judge, they meet the psychology of power. Most wrongful convictions begin in the first 48 hours, the window where police, under intense pressure from the public, search for someone who fits the crime. Not the person who did the crime. The person who psychologically satisfies the urgency. According to research from the Chicago Crime Lab, when investigators experience community pressure or media scrutiny, their decision-making becomes narrower. Their confirmation bias rises sharply, the belief that the first suspect is the right suspect. This pressure is invisible to the public, but devastating to those caught in its path. A real case example, non-graphic, documented. In a Midwestern case analyzed by the National Registry of Exonerations, a 22-year-old man was arrested after being spotted near the scene of a violent crime he had no connection to. He matched a vague, witness-fed description, one that psychologists later determined was memory contamination, the brain filling in details it did not actually see. During questioning, detectives interpreted his anxiety, shaking hands, uneven breathing as signs of guilt. But according to the APA, anxiety under interrogation has no reliable connection to guilt. It is simply the body responding to fear. Still, the assumption stuck. And from that moment, every neutral fact was interpreted as suspicious. A neighbor saying, he keeps to himself. A supervisor saying he's often late. A friend saying he can be emotional. In psychology, this is called confirmation spiraling. Once an investigator believes someone is guilty, new information is no longer evaluated neutrally. It is filtered. This was the first psychological trap that pushed him toward a wrongful conviction. Not violence. Not forensics. A simple human shortcut in thinking. He would later spend 11 years in prison before being exonerated. The psychology of false confessions. Most people believe they would never confess to a crime they didn't commit. But psychology, and decades of NIJ-funded research, proves the opposite. Under enough pressure, isolation, fear, and exhaustion, the human mind becomes vulnerable. Not weak, human. The APA identifies 3 conditions that dramatically increase the risk of false confession. Prolonged isolation. Sleep deprivation. Authority pressure paired with a promise of relief. Inside interrogation rooms, these conditions create what experts call compliance under distress. Not voluntary confession, but surrender. A documented Innocence Project case, clean, non-graphic. One of the most studied examples involves a teenager who was interrogated for nearly 12 hours straight. No lawyer. No parent. Just the psychological erosion of a young mind surrounded by adults insisting they already knew he was guilty. According to later court findings, investigators used a common psychological tactic, implying that confession is the only path to safety. The teen broke. Not because he was guilty, but because his brain believed the immediate threat would stop if he agreed. This is supported by NIJ research. When individuals, especially minors, face prolonged accusatory questioning, their brain shifts from prove innocence to make the discomfort end. He repeated details detectives fed him without realizing it. Later, DNA ruled him out completely. He had spent years believing the system would correct itself quickly. It didn't. His story is now used in legal psychology programs across the country to teach how false confessions form psychologically, not criminally. The science behind the collapse. Interrogations activate the body's stress response. Heart rate rises. Cognitive clarity drops. Decision-making becomes reactive. The mind becomes desperate for immediate relief, even at the cost of long-term consequences. According to social psychologist Saul Kassin, one of the world's leading experts on false confessions, individuals under high stress often lose the ability to assess future outcomes accurately. They focus only on escape. This explains why dozens of documented false confessors later say, "I thought I'd be able to fix it later." This moment, where the brain switches from defense to surrender, is the psychological turning point that has put innocent people on death row. The aftershock. Once a confession exists, even if retracted, even if disproven, even if impossible, the system treats it like truth. Jurors believe confessions more than eyewitnesses. Prosecutors treat them as case closers. Judges rarely dismiss them. It becomes a cognitive trap that leads all the way to a death sentence. And for many, there is no escape. When eyewitness memory turns deadly, most people trust their eyes. Most jurors trust eyewitnesses. But the brain is not a camera. It is a reconstruction machine. And in high-stress situations, it often reconstructs incorrectly. According to decades of research from the American Psychological Association and the National Institute of Justice, eyewitness mistakes are the leading cause of wrongful convictions in the United States. Not bad people. Not liars. Just human memory under pressure. How memory actually works, APA verified. Memory is not a single file stored on a hard drive. It is a series of impressions stitched together by the brain. Experts call this encoding under distress. When a person witnesses a violent or frightening event, the brain prioritizes survival, not accuracy. It remembers threat, motion, and fear, but loses details like faces, clothing, and timelines. Later, when police show lineups or ask questions, the brain tries to fill in the missing pieces. This reconstruction feels real to the witness and convincing to a jury. A real exoneration example from the National Registry, non-graphic. A man in the South spent nearly 30 years on death row after a single eyewitness claimed to recognize him at night from over 40 feet away. During trial, she sounded confident. But cognitive psychologists later determined that the lighting, distance, and stress made accurate identification almost impossible. DNA testing eventually cleared him, decades after the misidentification. The witness wasn't malicious. She was traumatized and did her best. But psychology shows that confidence is not the same as accuracy. This is one of the most dangerous misunderstandings jurors still hold today. The lineup problem. The Chicago Crime Lab found that traditional lineups often include subtle influences. A detective's tone. Their body language. The suggestive comment. The order of photos. One image standing out slightly more than others. These cues can unconsciously steer witnesses toward the person investigators already suspect. This phenomenon is called memory contamination. By the time the case reaches trial, the witness no longer remembers the subtle influences, only the confident belief in their memory. Confidence rises. Accuracy does not. The domino effect. One mistaken identification can trigger a chain reaction. Investigators narrow their search. Evidence is interpreted through a biased lens. Alternative suspects are ignored. Forensic interpretations become selective. Prosecutorial theory grows rigid. The jurors believe the eyewitness testimony. Once this chain activates, it becomes extremely difficult for innocence to break through. In many wrongful convictions later overturned, eyewitness misidentification was the first spark. The forensics trap, when science sends innocent people to death row. In the courtroom, forensic evidence is treated like the ultimate truth. But behind the polished language and confident expert testimony lies a difficult reality. Not all forensic methods are reliable. Some have been directly discredited by the NIJ, the National Academy of Sciences, and multiple wrongful conviction reviews. And yet, these same methods have contributed to sending innocent men and women to death row for decades. The illusion of certainty. Jurors hear phrases like, matched with certainty, consistent with the suspect, high probability. These statements sound scientific. But many forensic techniques rely on subjective interpretation, not measured precision. According to the National Academy of Sciences, error rates in several pattern-matching forensic fields remain unknown or untested. That means the evidence can seem airtight, even when it's built on fragile foundations. The error known as confirmation drift. Psychologist Craig Haney describes a phenomenon called confirmation drift. When forensic examiners know the police suspect a certain person, their interpretation becomes subtly biased, without them realizing it. It's not corruption. It's human cognition. If an examiner expects a match, their brain becomes more likely to interpret ambiguous patterns as confirmation. This unconscious shift has appeared repeatedly in wrongful conviction cases, especially those later overturned by DNA. A real case example, non-graphic, documented. In a case reviewed by the Innocence Project, a man was sentenced to death based largely on a forensic expert's claim of a conclusive match in hair comparison. Years later, FBI audits found significant flaws in the technique. DNA testing cleared the man after nearly 2 decades behind bars. The forensic examiner wasn't malicious. He simply overestimated the certainty of a method that should never have been presented as exact science. Why these errors happen? The pressure to solve serious crimes increases. Cognitive bias. Emotional investment. Tunnel vision. Urgency to deliver closure. Belief that the first suspect is the right suspect. According to the Chicago Crime Lab, high-stress investigative environments make examiners more susceptible to anchoring errors, interpreting data to support the theory already in play. This is dangerous because forensic testimony often carries more influence than eyewitnesses or police statements. Jurors often believe it automatically, even when the science behind it is weak. The misleading power of expert confidence. Studies reviewed by the APA show that juries heavily rely on how confident experts sound, how authoritative their language is, how well they explain their findings. Confidence becomes a substitute for accuracy. Complex details are simplified until they appear definitive. But in many wrongful conviction cases, the forensic certainty collapses under later scientific scrutiny, long after the damage is done. Some innocent people reach death row solely because flawed forensic interpretation made them seem guilty beyond doubt. When prosecutorial pressure becomes psychological blindness. Prosecutors are meant to seek truth, not simply win. But the reality inside many district attorney offices, especially during high-profile cases, creates a psychological environment where winning becomes synonymous with justice, even when the facts say otherwise. This isn't corruption. It's cognitive distortion. Psychologists call it motivated reasoning. When someone becomes so emotionally invested in an outcome that their mind unconsciously rejects anything that challenges it. This phenomenon has contributed to dozens of wrongful convictions, including innocent people sentenced to die. The psychology of tunnel vision, documented in NIJ research. When prosecutors face media pressure, political scrutiny, community fear, an emotionally charged crime, re-election timelines, their cognitive flexibility narrows. Instead of asking, what is the truth? The brain shifts to, how do we prove what we already believe? This mental shift is so common that the NIJ identifies it as one of the top systemic contributors to wrongful convictions. Tunnel vision makes contrary evidence seem unimportant, unreliable, or suspicious, even when it's the key to innocence. A real case example, non-graphic, verified. In a case later overturned by the National Registry of Exonerations, a man faced the death penalty despite significant evidence pointing to another suspect. Phone records, alibi witnesses, and even DNA inconsistencies were dismissed or minimized. Because the prosecution had already built a narrative, and that narrative was psychologically satisfying. Once a theory becomes a story that fits, contradictory facts are cognitively filtered out. This is known as confirmation maintenance, the mind defending its original conclusion. Years later, advanced DNA testing eliminated the man as a suspect entirely. He walked out of prison after more than 25 years. The prosecutor later admitted she had been too focused on the case theory to see alternatives. That is motivated reasoning in action. The authority bias effect. Jurors assume prosecutors are trustworthy. Judges assume prosecutors are prepared. Police assume prosecutors are correct. So when a prosecutor frames evidence confidently, it shapes the entire courtroom's perception. Psychology research from Haney shows that prosecutorial confidence can override logical contradictions, weak forensic interpretation, unreliable witnesses, coerced statements, alternative suspects. This bias is especially powerful in death penalty trials, where the stakes are highest and the emotional atmosphere is charged. Why innocent people don't stand a chance? Once a prosecutor publicly declares someone guilty, admitting uncertainty becomes career damage. Dropping charges looks like failure. Acknowledging flawed evidence feels like defeat. The pressure to stand firm intensifies. This emotional and political pressure shapes cognition. Not deliberately, but automatically. In several wrongful conviction reversals reviewed by the Chicago Crime Lab, post-conviction evidence that could have freed innocent defendants much earlier was dismissed or fought aggressively simply because accepting it would threaten the original narrative. This is the hidden psychological engine behind countless convictions that should never have happened. When defense fails, the psychology of being outmatched. Innocent people do not end up on death row simply because the system is flawed. They end up there because they enter the courtroom already psychologically defeated. Most wrongful conviction survivors describe the same moment. The instant they realize their defense attorney doesn't have the time, resources, or power to match the prosecution. And this imbalance is not fiction. It is documented repeatedly by the NIJ, Innocence Project, and National Registry of Exonerations. The cognitive overload of public defenders. Public defenders often carry more cases than any human mind can process effectively. The APA calls this cognitive overload saturation. It means the brain is juggling so many responsibilities that mistakes become inevitable. Overlooked evidence, missed inconsistencies, insufficient investigation, less time preparing for trial, fewer expert witnesses, minimal psychological insight into the defendant's behavior. It isn't incompetence, it's neurological exhaustion. Even the best-trained attorney cannot maintain accuracy under crushing caseloads. Meanwhile, prosecutors may have police investigators, forensic labs, prosecutors' offices, victim advocacy pressure, political momentum. This psychological inequality is one of the silent engines of wrongful death sentences. The innocent person's mental collapse. Psychologist Craig Haney documented an emotional pattern common among wrongfully accused individuals. Shock. This is a mistake. They'll fix it. Confusion. Evidence doesn't matter as much as they expected. Dread. Courtroom confidence from prosecutors feels overpowering. Helplessness. Defense struggles to keep up. Despair. The realization that innocence is not enough. This emotional trajectory mirrors the experiences of dozens of exonerees. Their biggest enemy wasn't the evidence. It was the belief, shared by jurors, that if someone is on trial for a death penalty case, the system must already be sure. That assumption is psychologically dangerous. A documented case with a silent defense failure. In a case later overturned by the National Registry of Exonerations, a man faced the death penalty even though a crucial witness had recanted their testimony before trial. His defense attorney, overwhelmed with multiple cases, failed to investigate the recantation fully. Failed to bring in expert psychological testimony. failed to question flawed forensic claims. Not because he didn't care, but because he was drowning under workload. Later, post-conviction attorneys uncovered the truth. The witness had been pressured, and the forensic claims were scientifically weak. The man had come within weeks of execution. He was released years later, but only after a team with adequate time and resources revisited the case. The cognitive dissonance of jurors. Jurors often assume, if the defendant really was innocent, the lawyer would have proved it. But psychology shows this assumption is false. Jurors suffer from authority bias and the competence fallacy, the belief that professionals always operate at peak ability. They rarely understand defense underfunding, overwhelming caseloads, time shortages, inability to hire expert witnesses, psychological exhaustion happening behind the scenes. This misunderstanding creates a perfect storm. Jurors trust the prosecution's confidence and underestimate the defense's struggle. For some innocent defendants, this imbalance becomes the reason they end up on death row. The final hours, death row psychology of the innocent. For those who survive conviction but remain on death row, the psychological burden is extreme. Even without committing a crime, the human mind must endure months, years, or decades under the constant threat of execution. According to Craig Haney and research by the CDC, death row inmates, innocent or guilty, experience a specific cognitive pattern. Hypervigilance. Every sound, every guard movement is analyzed for threats. Depression and learned helplessness, feeling powerless to influence outcomes. Survivor guilt, particularly for those who witness executions of co-inmates. Mental narrowing, focus shifts to immediate survival and routine. The paradox, the longer an innocent person survives, the more their mind adapts, yet psychological damage accumulates. The system inadvertently trains their brains to survive within the walls, even as society outside assumes they are guilty. The resilience factor. Some exonerees describe a coping strategy psychologists term adaptive dissociation. They compartmentalize their innocence versus the world's assumption of guilt. Fear versus the necessity to act normal. Time versus uncertainty. This strategy allows them to endure but leaves lasting trauma after release. According to APA studies, many exonerees require long-term mental health support to recover from institutionalized stress. The aftermath, life beyond exoneration. Even after release, the psychological ripple effects remain. PTSD from prolonged incarceration. Difficulty reintegrating into society. Distrust of authority. Persistent hypervigilance. The Innocence Project reports that some exonerees take years to rebuild relationships, employment, and trust in society. The system may have cleared their name, but the psychological scars endure. Lessons from innocent minds on death row. 50 innocent people. Decades of research. Thousands of lessons in human cognition, memory, and systemic bias. This documentary reveals a terrifying truth. The justice system is not just about law, it is about human psychology, both the fallibility of our minds and the structures that exploit it. From false confessions to misinterpreted eyewitnesses, flawed forensics, prosecutorial tunnel vision, and overworked defense attorneys, every step compounds the risk of executing someone innocent. Yet, resilience persists. Exonerees survive, adapt, and eventually share their stories, not to shock, but to teach. Their experiences are proof of both the fragility and endurance of the human mind. Make the system listen. If this documentary opened your eyes to the psychology behind wrongful convictions, take action. White heavy checkmark subscribe for more verified, high-impact documentaries. White heavy checkmark share this video to educate others about systemic flaws. White heavy checkmark comment on what shocked you most. Your voice amplifies awareness. Justice is more than law. It's human psychology. And understanding it is the first step toward preventing the next innocent person from facing death row.